Well, hello friends, and welcome to Ask Zach. Today we're going to talk about one of my favorite artists and what I think is probably their greatest album of all time, and a really influential record to me, one that kind of was a gateway drug to all sorts of R&B and blues, and of course Texas Roadhouse music, and that is Delbert McClinton's Live from Austin. This is an amazing record, and I'm going to talk about it and talk about the players on it, talk about the guitarists on there, David Millsap, and the late and great Stephen Bruton, who is one of my favorite players. So this also gives me a chance to kind of talk about Stephen Bruton's career and his influence. And yeah, and I hope you will take away an appreciation, if you don't already have one, for Delbert McClinton, and that you'll go out and listen to this album and maybe some other great Delbert records. I wish he was still performing. He's kind of retired at this point. I think he still does some cruises every once in a while. But yeah, all right. So before we dive in, I just want to thank my Patreon supporters, because they keep this show going, and I'm grateful. So thank you to them. If you would like to join them or find out more, well, there's a link in the description. All right, so a little bit of background info, just about how I was clued into this album. So I was raised pretty strict. As a teenager, I was playing guitar in an Assembly of God church. So I played youth group on Friday nights, and I played Sunday morning and Sunday night and Wednesday night services. So I played 4 services a week, starting when I was about 13 years old. When I got a little bit older, I started really trying to learn from the drummer that was in our church, because he started showing me some cool vintage guitars that he had. Even though he wasn't a guitar player, the drummer, his name was Ray Mosby, and he was from the Tulsa area. He had some really cool vintage guitars. He had some old Strats, and he also had a 61 Les Paul SG. He had an early 80s Les Paul Custom that had a Kahler locking tremolo system on it. Talk about a bunch of wood taken out. He had a 57 Tweed Vibrolux, and he had like a late 60s Silverface Bandmaster reverb head and cabinet. And he would let me borrow these things, and he would bring them to church, and he'd let me use them in the services and such. And so it was a lot of fun. Well, I started kind of hearing some of the music he was listening to, because of course, you know, my parents really didn't let me listen to any kind of non-gospel CCM, you know, Christian music. But he was listening to stuff like Ry Cooder and J.J. Cale and Delbert McClinton and all these different things that I didn't really know who they were, and it sounded really foreign to me, because there was nothing in the gospel music or whatever I was listening to that sounded anything like that. Well, when I got to be 16, you know, of course I had a driver's license, and I'd start driving over to see him, and he would start playing me, you know, records. And so that's where I got exposed to Eric Clapton and Chuck Berry and all sorts of different, you know, music. And one day when we were, you know, visiting, and of course I was playing through his Tweed Vibrolux and just loving, you know, the sound and the feel of these vintage guitars and amps and such. One day when I was leaving, he gave me a cassette, and it was a, you know, a dubbed cassette. So of course there was no writing on it or anything. And he said, "You need to listen to this." I said, "Okay." And so when I got in the car and put in the cassette, well, it was Delbert McClinton, Live from Austin. And I wore that cassette out. I played it nonstop. It was really a gateway drug to kind of R&B music, and just a great, kind of Texas Roadhouse or just kind of R&B band. The fact that you had a big rhythm section, with a B3 / piano player, you had the, drums and bass, you had 2 guitar players, and then you had a horn section. Sounds similar to the Blues Brothers band. Well, that's because the Blues Brothers were very influenced by Delbert McClinton. Well, I, just really wore that out. And then the thing that was really interesting was that all of a sudden that performance was on television, because unbeknownst to me, the audio was taken from a performance on Austin City Limits. So then all of a sudden I was able to see, what was going on also. And I was able to see the guitar players and see who was playing what. And that was a really wonderful revelation. And I became a big fan of Stephen Bruton and David Millsap. And one thing that was really interesting was I had listened to the album so much that when I saw the Austin City Limits, episode on television, I could tell the difference between the two, because they weren't the same. And of course they had been mixed slightly differently. And also they were edited differently. So, it's a different order of songs, and also some of the songs were shortened. So at times, the Austin City Limits version of the song is longer because it's the full performance. While on the album here, at times they would pull out a horn solo or a guitar solo to shorten the song to make it where it was more like 4 minutes long instead of 5 minutes long. So, really enjoyed that. And also, of course, watching it on Austin City Limits, you could see what kind of guitars they were playing and everything. And so Stephen Bruton's guitar playing was very interesting to me. And part of what it was is that he played a Telecaster with a B-bender, but he used it in a very non-country way. He wasn't doing any type of Clarence White or Albert Lee or Ricky Skaggs type, B-bender licks. He was, using it in a very kind of R&B, kind of rock, kind of way. And he was using, of course, a little bit, dirtier of a tone. So, and that's one thing that I really think guys should check out is, I think Bruton was probably one of the guys that used a B-bender in the most non-traditional way. And that didn't mean he couldn't do that, but he was able to use it just as a tool and not, all of a sudden I have a B-bender, I'm going to start playing Clarence White licks. So I really loved that. Yeah, the gear they were using was cool. So Bruton had this all black Telecaster that had EMG pickups and had a Parsons White, string bender on it on the B string. And he also had a red, it was a Fiesta red 80s, Fender reissue 62 Strat. And those were his 2 guitars, and he had a Blackface Vibrolux reverb, and he had Ibanez made this UE series, and it was a rack mount, double space rack, but it was analog effects with knobs, no, digital programming stuff, and it had a little foot controller thing that had a heavy duty cable that connected it. And so that was his rig. And then the other guitarist, who was David Millsap, he had a real Blackguard, and he was using a Blackface Super Reverb, and he had a couple of Boss pedals sitting on top of his amp. It looked like it was probably a Boss overdrive like the SD1, and then I think an Octaver, and then a delay. So, and one of the things that was really interesting about this whole album and the two guitarists interplay was the backstory that I got from James Pennebaker. Now, Delbert McClinton has had an amazing list of great guitar players play in his band. And probably one of the first was James Pennebaker. And if you're not familiar with James, you ought to look him up. He's a really great guitarist. And he played with Delbert for quite a while throughout the 70s and 80s. And I think was on some of his first hits like Giving It Up For Your Love. But James told me the backstory on this album in that David Millsap was the guitarist in the band and that Bruton was just sitting in. So Bruton was probably playing with Chris Christopherson at that point, who of course a long-term gig that he had, and Bruton's just sitting in. And the album is amazing because of the interplay between the two guitarists. So on a lot of the songs, David Millsap is playing the main riff, and that's because it's his gig, and and he's the one that's been doing that. And so Bruton ends up playing all these complementary parts. And probably my favorite example of them complementing each other in their playing is they play the old Otis Redding tune, Dreams to Remember. And it's in 6/8, and it's got that, of course, the part that Cropper, that Steve Cropper played. You have that. Well, Millsap's playing that part, and then Stephen Bruton takes it up a third and plays. And when you hear the album and when you hear those two parts together, it just sounds amazing because they're just locked in together, and it's a wonderful just example of two guitar players really working together to make for a really great musical performance. And it's one of the reasons why the album's just one of my favorites of all time. Is it's like two guitar players that are really simpatico. They're really you can tell they like each other, they respect each other, and they're trading off. They're each, both of them are taking solos and doing their thing, and their sounds work together, and it's just a great album. Just to give a little bit of info on Stephen Bruton. Bruton was born in Delaware, and but his parents moved to the Fort Worth area when he was 2. His parents had a record shop there, and that's what he grew up there. And he got hooked up with Delbert McClinton and got hooked up with Chris Christopherson early on. I think he started playing with Christopherson in like 70 or 71. Appeared in movies, as Christopherson did movies. Stephen Bruton was, had bit parts in those films, and sometimes he plays you can see him sometimes as a general or a bartender, or all sorts of different roles that he played through the years. There's many performances of Christopherson with Bruton playing guitar with him, usually that same black telly with the string bender, and a lot of times in the 80s he's playing that Fiesta Red 62 reissue Strat. And he would play with Delbert off and on, kind of sitting in because they were old friends. And then in the late 80s, early 90s, Bruton started playing with Bonnie Raitt when her career kind of exploded. And I think the album after Nick of Time, like Something to Talk About, that era, I think he started playing with her. In fact, he's in that video. And yeah, there's a lot of performances of Bruton playing with Bonnie Raitt, because of course she was very hot and she was on a lot of television shows at that point. Bruton seemed to really like gear and to be a gear hound, just like the rest of us. And in the 90s, he started using Dumble Overdrive special amps, and he had some PRS guitars that kind of look similar to DGTs. He played custom shop Fenders. He really liked dot neck 335s, and so you'd see him playing a number of different Sunburst dot neck 335s, and he started a solo career. He was a great songwriter. A lot of people covered his tunes, and of course he did a bunch of great solo records. Unfortunately, he got throat cancer, and probably the last thing he did was he worked with T-Bone Burnett, another old kind of Dallas-Fort Worth friend, on the soundtrack for Crazy Heart. And of course, he was also involved in just the making of the movie in general. And I think the movie, if I remember correctly, the movie is dedicated to Bruton. But he was an incredibly influential guitarist and songwriter, and everyone that knew him kind of felt like they were his best friend. And he seemed to be a really great guy. I only got to see him on TV and such, but my friend J.D. Simo got to open a show for him, and he said it really changed his life and really changed what he wanted to do, because at the time J.D. was really kind of doing a Steve Ray Vaughan, Jimi Hendrix kind of routine, and Bruton made him really think about songwriting and playing parts and doing your own thing, not just aping Stevie Ray and Jimi Hendrix. So this album, really, really important to me, and you really need to check it out. I need to mention just all the guitar players, just a short list of the players that have been through Delbert McClinton's band. Of course, some of the early albums had Reggie Young playing on them. James Pennebaker toured with him and also recorded with him for years. You had, of course, David Millsap. You had Stephen Bruton. You had Todd Sharp, played with him for a while, as did Rob McNelly. There's a lot of footage of Rob McNelly playing with Delbert McClinton. You also have Bob Britt, who's now playing with Bob Dylan. He played with old Delbert for a long time. So yeah, it's and some of the records in the 90s that he did have Stuart Smith playing guitar on them. So if you ever pick up a Delbert McClinton record, it's going to have great guitar playing on it, and also great songs and great arrangements, and it's and it's just that fun mix of R&B with a dash of country and soul and rock and all sorts of things combined together. And of course, I have to mention Delbert, of course, native Texan, and probably he's famous for playing on the Bruce Chanel, Hey Baby. That's him, playing the harmonica part, which of course they ended up running into the Beatles, and it's always been talked about how Delbert evidently showed John Lennon some harmonica things, which of course led to some of the like Love Me Do and other things that the Beatles did. All right, let's look at that intro guitar part. Standing on shaky ground. It's not hard. It's just a so you just have it's in the key of E, and you're hitting. You have the little scratchy part. So you have this, low E, then the octave E. Then you're hitting this, C sharp. Then the D. Then you do the scratchy. And then you have the walk-up part. So easy but fun little guitar part. All right, guys. Well, I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Again, thank you to my Patreon supporters. Go listen to some Delbert McClinton. Also check out some Stephen Bruton. Thanks, guys. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.